Friends, let us pray together. God, may the words of my mouth, may the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you this day, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Oh, Peter, God bless you. This scene is so characteristically Peter. He is the disciple who is so often the first one to speak, whether the time is right or not, the first to jump into a conversation and spout his suggestions and anecdotes, and he's quick to wig out and lose self-control as soon as things start to get uncomfortable and difficult. Yes, this is so like me. I mean Peter. No, I really mean me. Of all the scriptures we are studying in this series, Unraveled, this is the one that speaks to me right away. Peter is the character that I can probably identify most with in the Bible. I am so Peter in this story in like 100 different ways. But let's be honest, the man gets a bad rap for this story as it's told. Several translations interpret the words of Jesus after Peter stumbles as "you of little faith." Those words certainly sting. And maybe they were true of Peter in that moment, but they almost seem like an unjust censure of the very real fear of this situation. The more I read the story and try to relate to it, the less it feels like it's about any lack of faith in Peter. After all, if Peter didn't have faith in Jesus' power, he wouldn't have asked Jesus to call him out on the water at all. What I instead find in this story is a deep sense of connection to what it is like to be human in a time of crisis. We all know what that's like right now. But Peter's crisis didn't begin with this storm in the middle of the night. Let's rewind for a moment and look at what else has been happening in the lives of the disciples leading up to this point. They've left their families behind, at least for the time being, to follow this strange and radical teacher. They've witnessed him perform signs and miracles that have changed their entire perception of reality. They've heard him interpret the ancient scriptures of their religion in ways that challenge their theology. They've seen him interact with people in places and in conversations that have challenged all of their assumptions. Jesus has pretty much turned everything upside down in their lives. Oh, and if that wasn't already enough, at the beginning of this same chapter in the Gospel of Matthew, John the Baptist, who the disciples had grown to revere and love and respect, is beheaded for being a troublemaker and is served to Herod's wife on a silver platter, literally. So if I try and put myself in Peter's situation, it feels pretty overwhelming. And from what I know about myself, there's not much chance I could successfully rely on my own judgment in such a situation. And so we come to this word, unraveled. I can only imagine that Peter and the other disciples were feeling pretty unraveled in this situation. They're tired, they're confused, they're bewildered, they're frightened. Heck, they're freaking out. And here comes Jesus floating across the water, saying, "Take courage, don't be afraid." And I'm sure, being disciples and all, it was really easy for them in that moment to just stop being afraid as the waves continued to batter the boat and it filled with water, because Jesus hasn't calmed the storm yet in this story. And good, faithful Peter is going to take control of the situation and put matters into his own hands. And I like how Eugene Peterson's interpretation in the Message says that Peter was suddenly bold. "I have an idea," he might say to himself, and he asked Jesus for quite possibly the most impossible thing in the situation. And shockingly, Jesus goes along with it. "Come ahead," Jesus said calmly, and Peter steps out in faith, we might add. And all goes well at first, until Peter looks at the waves churning below him. And then he panics. and he loses his nerve, as the translation says, and, oh God, he begins to sink. And there is screaming and crying and desperate pleas for help, and Jesus reaches out his hand. And he grabs Peter out of the water, and he says, faint heart. Not you of little faith, but in this translation, faint heart. What got into you? What changed? Why were you suddenly afraid when just moments ago you had all the faith necessary to walk on water? What happened to Peter? I don't know. Being human happened to Peter. I can't tell you how many situations similar to the plot line of this story I found myself in with God. I feel powerless and afraid, and I know in my gut that I am sunk if I don't rely on Jesus. And I want to trust, but I'm gonna need a sign. And not just any sign, because God has already given me signs. Like Peter, I've already seen God perform miracles in my life. I've already felt the comforting presence of Jesus. I've already been saved more than once. And dang it, you'd think that'd be enough. But it's not. And apparently it wasn't for Peter either. No, God, I say, I want us to really test my faith this time. So I'm going to ask you for something really hard, like impossibly hard, and really, you need to make sure that it has all of my desired outcomes and feels completely exhausting and uses every last bit of my intellect, because that's the only thing that's going to make sense to me. Because my fear makes me completely insane. And I become just like Naaman. I hear the words of Jesus echo the words of the prophet in that story. If I'd asked you to do something difficult, you would have done it. So why do you hold back? And meanwhile, my life unravels, and I am sinking, and I am crying out to Jesus because my way of doing things isn't working. Again. Shocking. And Jesus grabs my hand and pulls my sogginess up out of the water and asks with all the calmness of a wise old sage, what got into you? I recently watched Sight and Sound's theater production of Jesus. This story on the sea appears in the movie, and in it Jesus has some additional dialogue that's not found in the Bible text, but we can easily read it between the lines. Jesus shouts out to Peter when he's sinking into the water, Peter, keep your eyes on me, not on the storm. You can do it. Keep your eyes on me, not on the storm around you. And at first, Peter does just what Jesus asks, and he walks across the waves, and amazed at his own success, he then looks away from Jesus and quickly begins to sink as fear overwhelms him once again as he becomes aware of the waves. What was the moment when things went wrong? You know. I know. We all know. It's the age-old test of faith. It's the answer we've heard 1,000 times, and we hear it again today. It's why we keep coming back here to hear it, because we need to hear it again and again. Keep your eyes on Jesus. When things get rough, turn your eyes upon Jesus. My friends, life has been slowly unraveling all around us over these last 8 weeks. We don't know what to think. We don't know what to expect. Everything that we know and have taken for granted has now been turned upside down. And we don't know when things will feel safe, when they'll feel normal again. and we're tired, and we're grieving. Let me say that again. We're grieving. We are grieving our friends and family members who are sick or who have died. We're grieving the fact that we can't properly grieve them right now in social isolation. We're grieving social isolation, the lack of physical connection and presence. We are grieving the need to do life completely differently right now, to not get to do what we want, to not get to see the people that we want, to not get to go where we want to go. We are grieving. The whole world is grieving this loss. So what do we do? What do we do in this time of grief that threatens to unravel us? The answer is, we grieve. We let ourselves grieve because we are human, and grief and crisis and struggle are a part of life, whether we like it or not. And as much as I hate to admit this reality, God never promised us a life without sorrow or pain. God didn't even spare Jesus pain and suffering, which has to mean that there is some hidden purpose in pain, but whether or not that's true, it sure doesn't feel very comforting right now. Because there's nothing comfortable about pain or grief. There's nothing comfortable about the feeling of sinking into the waves. There's nothing comfortable about a pandemic. So where is Jesus going to show up in all this? Well, he already has. The better question is, where are we going to look in this time of crisis? Are we going to keep our eyes on the storm that's going on around us? Or are we going to fix our eyes ahead on Jesus? What will you do in that moment of panic when the waves of grief and pain and loss swamp your boat, when the fear feels like it's drowning you and you can't breathe and you just want to escape in any way possible, any way that doesn't require walking through to the other side? What will you do? And where will you look for help? If you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade, you may remember the scene where he arrives at the edge of this chasm, almost falling off as his run comes to a screeching halt, and there is no bridge. And death is looming behind him, and there is no choice but to take a step right off the edge of the cliff, right into what feels like certain bitter death. And with clenched fists and bated breath, the man steps off the edge, only to discover right at that panicked moment an invisible bridge that forms a path across the abyss to safety. And that bridge is grace. You see, if he had never taken that first step forward, he never would have crossed to safety. If he had chosen not to face death and fear head on and follow the voice within himself, he would have been overcome. That would have been the end of that. And instead, the very step that looked and felt like it was off the edge of a cliff was the very step that saved him. You may be standing at the edge of that abyss. We all have our own abyss. And there's only one way to get across. So in your moment of fear, where are you going to look? Are you going to look down into the abyss? Are you going to look around you at the storm? Or are you going to look straight ahead at Jesus and take a deep breath and just take a step forward on faith, trusting that that step is right where you need to be? Don't think twice. Don't believe what fear has to tell you, because Jesus has already shown up, and he is already waiting to catch you if you fall. You will be okay. We will be okay. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah.